We're going to get started here in a minute or so. We're good on the recording? Wonderful. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and call this regular meeting of the Assembly's Housing and Homelessness Committee to order. It is Thursday, June 8th. We are noticed today from 11 to 12:30. Let's go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions.
Hannah Brawley.
Felix Rivera.
Kevin Cross.
All right, and then do we have any members on the phone? No. All right, great. So then next we have initial audience participation. So I believe we have one individual who signed up, Mr. Oliva. I will put on your 3-minute timer and we'll let you know when you have 30 seconds left. You're funny, but no, I said 3. It's not on. You have to press it. It's green lights that's on.
Oh, give me 10 seconds. You didn't tell me that. Okay, Ronald Leva, I've been here probably the most anyone, adjacent property owner to the brother Francis. I've given you multiple proposals for buying my property and if nothing else, make up the shortage on your contract. You can see in the packet that city government buys property near Anchorage. And then also you can see that Wagner put out a press release and said they bought it. And no one bought it. I still own it. And yesterday we had an incident, again, a break-in. I'm blood in the water. But this time they came through the Brother Francis shelter's fence. Now, they have their facility fence, so they either came through the building or had to climb their fence, then cut my fence, and then made it through military razor wire and got my copper. So they had to go back up that way. So in a good neighbor policy, I went over and met with Dave Rittenberg, which he came to my house and I explained to him how the homeless with this dead tree caused me financial disaster. And that dead tree, I cut 5 years later. The settlement was $400,000. Unfortunately, my wife turned 65, cashed in her entire retirement, a big marital riff, but also we don't get the money back in 60 days. It's an additional 120. And the other tree was a dead mayday, an invasive species. It's a unique story, but caused by homelessness. Anyway, the reason you should consider strongly my property is, one, I can't keep my business there, so I am in the process of vacating. I would accelerate that to a baseball field situation on 3 acres. And that way you could have tiny homes, pellet homes, camping sites. I got enough room for motor homes, and it would be more economical and less resistance to go to Cuddy Park next to Lowe's. After listening to Lowe's testimony, that was a disaster.
Ron, just letting you know you have 30 seconds left.
Oh, okay, I added 10, so it's 40. No, we're all right. But here's the point. We're close to the navigation center. Everything points to the navigation center. They're already there at the old Native Hospital. So in conclusion, why would you put any money on the other side of town if they're all directed to the navigation center? And Dave Rittenberg said he could handle it because the interview's only 20 minutes. Once you go in, give them a wristband. If they don't have a wristband that they've been to the navigation center, then they're trespassing because they were offered alternative housing.
Thank you, Mr.
Do you have any questions?
Don't see any. Thank you.
You're welcome, Felix. I'm preparing a slideshow with aerial photos, and I hope to present it to the committee before you spend any money, because this will be a good long-term investment versus disruption throughout the city.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. Okay. All right, so that's it for initial audience participation. As always, we will have final audience participation after we're done with our business. So moving us on, there's a couple items that are tabled on the agenda. There's just too much going on right now for us to dive into those other items, but certainly hope to have them in the near future. So that also just of note, this is our regular meeting. Typically, we have our regular Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting on the third Wednesday of the month. But in collaboration with the administration, we moved this one up because there were some concerns about the 23-24 winter season and the need to plan in advance for that season. So that is why this meeting was moved up. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the abatement policy. Are there any updates the Department of Law can let us know about the abatement policy?
Through the chair, thank you so much for having this meeting. I was going to invite a couple of members of my department up, Jessica Willoughby and Ashton, who is our new intern. If you could kind of come up and sit with us. So I thought this was an important meeting because there's an awful lot of, you could call it confusion, but there's understandable confusion with the abatement process right now, the one at Cuddy Park and the one that we've discussed sort of collaterally, the abatement policy that the administration has asked us to put together. So I'm going to try to separate these issues out because they are two separate issues. Although they're related, they're two separate issues. So I'll start with the Cuddy Park abatement issue. There has been a lot of interest in this issue, and one thing we want to communicate to the body and to the public is that this is of paramount importance to the administration. It's of paramount importance to the city and to the local communities. After Martin v. Boise, the municipality stopped enforcement of its code prohibiting camping on municipal land. but the municipality covers roughly 1,900 square miles, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. In addition to this unique distinction, the city owns and manages land roughly twice the size of American Samoa. Abatement has been characterized as a harsh process, and in fact, it can be a harsh process. It's not lost on us that abatement can be very personal to the citizens who are affected by it. However, limited circumstances do arise from time to time when abatement is necessary, can be compassionate, but abatement is necessary to occur. And these limited circumstances we have identified are, 1, areas that are closed to the public. So an example of that would be a third party getting a permit to rent a park for a specific purpose. 2, where exigent circumstances posing a serious risk to human life or safety exist. 3, where the municipality is working to maintain accessibility, such as our obligation to be ADA compliant. So as you may have seen and heard, 3 parcels of municipal land known as Cuddy Park, Lusac Library, and the old archive site are being closed to the public in anticipation of a large community enriching and permitted event. A zone area abatement was utilized for that event to ensure sufficient time for people to collect their personal property. No one has been cited criminally or otherwise. The municipality is also providing outreach services to the extent that that's possible in conjunction with the health department and Parks and Rec to facilitate a smooth transition for any affected citizen. The mayor's office is working on a new abatement policy. So this is related, but separate. One that seeks to expand the areas that are subject to reasonable and compassionate abatement, regardless of shelter space. I've reviewed and approved a draft language and policy that will become public once it is final. And before it can become final, it needs to go through our policies and procedures process. In the interim, the municipality will continue the day in and day out hard work that we are doing to keep our city clean and safe for all residents, housed or unhoused. And with that, I thought one thing we could do, since Jessica Willoughby is here, is she might be able to also give some background or depth to this or answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks. So a couple questions from me. So first is up until the draft policy goes through the PNP process, is it fair to say that the abatement policy is going to be the 3 specific criteria that you outlined?
That's correct.
Okay. And then can you detail a little bit what the PNP process looks like and the time that it takes to go through that process?
Yes, I believe that Mr. Bird might be able to explain that process a bit better. Is that true? Or Jessica?
Sure. The policy and procedure process is laid out in policy and procedure 1-1. It's a fairly dated process, but I think it works for the municipality. It's generally held by the Office of Management and Budget, and they help shepherd either amended policy and procedures through a review process. It's kind of case by case in terms of what department reviews what policy and procedure, depending on the subject matter. Through the chair, to the second part of the question, a timeline, a week or 2, depending.
Yeah, I have a few questions. I'll just ask a couple of them right now. On the policy and procedure process, you mentioned it depends on the departments. What are the relevant departments that this policy is being moved through in addition to law?
Off the top of my head, I think OMB has the master discretion of who reviews what P&P, and I would think Parks and Rec is a part of this, APD is a part of this, and the Department of Law is a part of this, and the Health Department as well.
Okay, and I guess I would, well, I don't know if you have any control over it, but perhaps AFD as well, only because I know I'm a little familiar with our cold weather code and the policies around that in terms of, if someone's outside and there's a below a certain number of degrees. So I would recommend including the fire department. My other question is specifically about the Cuddy abatement. So I'm just curious, and this came up at our meeting on Tuesday. I was just curious, I guess the lag or discrepancy in communication between basically what we heard from the festival organizer that there was a meeting or discussion in late April about the need to abate, and then there was no additional communication or notice until May 24th. And the reason I bring that up is because the timing lines up such that a whole bunch of people left the Sullivan, had to go somewhere, and I know I don't know how many of them specifically ended up there. And of course there was no guidance about where they could legally go, and so it seems like if the intent for a month was to, proceed with abatement, I understand there's a maximum notice for that abatement usually, but I just want to flag the fact that there is that discrepancy, and it's, I think it's led to a lot of the public confusion and frustration.
Through the chair to Ms. Brawley, first and foremost, I would like to apologize to the Showdown Productions, because I know that they've taken a lot of flack for this, and it shouldn't be on them for the problems that the municipality has created for them. And so I will tell you, it came to our attention, there was a lagging communication between this event happening. They had actually approached us and said, hey, what's your thoughts? We have some people in Cuddy. And that's when we came to the law department, and Parks and Rec, AHD came together with the law department and said, do we have a public safety issue? How do we comply with Martin v. Boise? What's our plan? Is this is this doable? What's our mode? And so there was quite a few engagements that had to happen before we could legally even communicate that this was a possibility. We engaged with the coalition. We let assembly members know as soon as possible. It's unfortunately just the process of government that kind of took place, but the beginning happened with us for not realizing we did have a private rental for a facility. And at the time, the municipality could not direct people where to go. It's a very unfortunate situation. And it was I believe, a failure on the municipality and not on Showdown in any capacity. So I'd like to apologize for that.
Thank you. Want to note for the record that we've been joined by Mr. Soltz a couple minutes ago on the phone. So a couple additional questions I have. First is specific to the 3 parcels in Midtown that are currently being abated. What is the status of that abatement?
Through the chair, I believe the abatement process started yesterday. Was it the 6th? Sorry, my days are all messed up. So it started Tuesday. We had CAP and not AHD, Parks and Rec on site doing cleanup and communicating. I believe the coalition, their contracted outreach was there as well prior to the abatement. I'm getting a nod from Jessica Parks with the coalition in the audience. So yes, we had outreach on site the day prior, the day of, and then we started the abatement on Tuesday, the 6th.
And when is the abatement slated to be done?
If I understand the question correctly, usually the abatement ends once it's cleaned, but the concert does start the 15th. So I believe or the 16th. I'd have to double check, but it's most likely going to butt up to the concert.
Yeah, let me refine the question a little bit. So and this is anecdotal because I actually haven't driven by there today, but I did get some anecdotal reports that there are encampments there as of this morning. So can the municipality just be clear about what you're going to be doing about that?
Through the chair, I know that there are some people still on site that AHD and the coalition are working with to hopefully try and find some resources. We're trying to take a gentle approach because it is a very sensitive topic for all involved.
Got it. Thanks. And then second question was, and maybe the Department of Law doesn't want to comment on the record, but does the Department of Law have a comment about the ACLU action and the impact that might have?
Should I field that?
Sure. To my knowledge, we haven't received, did we get any lawsuit? Okay, I'll just,
Through the chair, it is the Department of Law's position not to comment on active litigation. What we have is not quite active litigation. Our code envisions a lenient notice procedure for appellate rights as part of the abatement of prohibited campsites. So we commit in code that you don't actually even have to file with court, that it's sufficient to give us written notice that you intend to file with court, and administrative appeal of the abatement decision to abate. And we have received a notice of an intent to file something with court. And then our code envisions, in the case that notice or an appeal is filed with court, then the municipality shifts into storage of the personal effects of that person if they so choose.
Got it. Thanks. Mr. Cross?
I'm going to the Addressing Homelessness website in the MOA, and I'm assuming that's the abatement process that's posted here. Can we speak a little bit about what is taking place starting, sounds like today, for those 3 sites? Are we transporting people to the navigation center over by Beans Cafe, or are we just posting notice? Like, can you tell me a little bit of what the ground level and what's taking place? Like, if I were at the camp, what would I be experiencing? What would I be seeing?
Through the chair to Mr. Cross, that's a pretty broad question. We do have outreach on site that has been connecting campers with resources. I know the coalition has been very active and engaging. We gave additional notice when the abatement was posted. I believe the 10-day window started on the 3rd. We actually didn't start the abatement process until the 6th so that the coalition could get everybody on site. I don't believe we are actively engaging in transportation, but not to say like 3rd Avenue Navigation Center normally brings the shuttle bus for anyone that wants to transport. I mean, resources are on site and they're accessible, and we're still working with some of the campers that are still there.
And if I were just to deny any of those and continue to camp, what then?
Yeah, we hope to not get to a situation like that where it's kind of in an escalated or like a heightened situation. At that point, you would have to they would be trespassed essentially, and then the trespass process would occur at that point. But we would hope not to get to that point because it's very traumatizing and it's a very unfortunate situation that happens.
Okay, thank you. And I just speak from and I'm just kind of curious, and the reason I ask is from my own experience. The last several years, I had, you wouldn't call them campers, you'd call squatters move into properties, found units that were vacant in some of my buildings. And what would happen is that at the time, they weren't really, it was an interesting process, but the Anchorage Police Department would show up, the individuals that were on there say, I didn't break in, someone let me in. So they were saying, well, they're just a trespasser. You didn't catch them in the act. We can't prove that someone did invite them onto the property. It was interesting, but they would just say, please get out of here. And you'd watch the individuals go down and check the doors on other properties and looking to try to access other properties. And it just wasn't, my concern is as we abate, what does that process look like? Just because in my experience, they leave and come right back. Some individuals, not all, some just leave and come back. And so how do you enforce something where there's either no consequences? And so because I don't want us to exert a bunch of efforts if the answer is that I just walk away for a block and then come back and I got to restart a process.
Through the chair, and maybe Ms. Willoughby can speak a little bit more about the zone abatement process, but once a zone is closed for abatement, you cannot occupy that space. And if you continue to occupy the space or to walk down the block and come back, there is a process for trespass. And we don't want to get to that stage. We'd like to offer the resources so that staying on the site is not the best option. There's other resources available. maybe you can expand on the actual zone abatement process.
Taking off the Department of Law and putting on, I think, the response you would hear from Parks and Rec and CAP, who do really a lot of the heavy lifting in these situations, I think they would attest that abatement is a resource-heavy process. And we are limited by capacity all the time in terms of what our priority areas are. So no, I don't think there's any denying that this is not a resource-intensive process, and we don't make these decisions lightly.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll ask my other question with the caveat that it's not an easy one to answer, so you guys can opt out of answering it. But so one legal action that the city has in their toolbox, apparently now more than we thought, is abatement to deal with folks who are unsheltered, and this situation that we do not have adequate shelter options, nor do we have adequate housing options in our city. The other thing that's in our code that is legally available to the administration is to declare an emergency. So I'm aware that there's provisions where the mayor can declare an emergency, and there's specifically a provision that the Anchorage Health Department director can declare an emergency, and it's been done before. It was done in 2019, and I believe it's one of the mechanisms that's used every winter, and the purpose of it is to suspend certain things like zoning rules and allow temporary occupancy by folks in buildings that otherwise are not residential buildings. So I just wonder if that's something from the health department, and Alexis, I appreciate that you're not the director. If that's something the health department or the Department of Law or the administration in general has contemplated at this time.
The Department of Law at this time has not contemplated the declaration of an emergency. I don't know if I haven't.
I can speak on behalf of the Anchorage Health Department. In the code provision, I believe it's 16.125. It says that the health director can declare in writing a public safety or a health and safety declaration, and there has not been internal discussions for that mechanism. You might be able to speak for the administration.
Through the chair to Member Brawley, my understanding is that this administration has declared an emergency with regard to the Highland avalanche. Is there another time that that's occurred? So if Member Brawley, if you're asking us to go through the criteria and look at whether this is an emergency, not opposed to doing so, but I think there's a process, and that process has not been addressed within the administration, but I'm happy to entertain, and I'll certainly communicate that to the mayor.
Thank you. And I also want to state, I understand that that act would also come with the need for resources, right? Because it would mean taking action. So I'm not suggesting that it's even feasible at this point or that it could be paid for, but I just want to state that it's there in the code. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, I'm not seeing any other discussion, so I'll move us on to our main topic for today, which is the 2023-2024 Emergency Cold Weather Shelter Plan. If the attorneys want to stay here for that, feel free to, but you're good to go. Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
One quick question came up while Mr. Oliva was giving his testimony. Has there been any, and I don't expect you to know this off the top of your hand, but perhaps you can look, any legal precedent set on the negative environmental impacts of whether it's a approved campsite or a navigation center? What I mean by that is if I, as a private individual, were to go on to and either start an auto body store or something, and I stored, antifreeze or some of that, and I had runoff, environmentally, I would be liable for any of the negative environmental impacts of the properties around me. Now, it's different because we're talking about a human attribute. When they go onto properties, they cause harm or something like that. What is legally the ramifications or responsibilities of the municipality or whatever agency that owns that property for how it affects the owners? And has there been any cases that stipulate the rights of the property owners in adjacent or in the general vicinity? Thank you.
Through the chair, I cannot speak specifically to liabilities for environmental damage in, in the way that you contemplate, individuals' situations from camping causing environmental issues. However, the abatement policy and going forward is going to take into consideration environmental issues. So the administration of the Department of Law is going to, in their finalizing the policy, is going to try and ensure that environmental damage would not occur from the camps. We're going to try to make sure the environmental is protected.
Thank you. And the reason I ask is that when we set up whether, and that's one thing to look at as far as when we talk about our authorized campsites or whatever that looks like in the future. If I, as a landlord or I, as a property owner, have a tenant or an occupant, and they decide to service their big truck in my driveway and they dump all their oil out into the street or whatever that looks like, they're not going to go after that tenant. They're going to come after me as a property owner. And I want to know what safeguards we have in place and how do we protect the people around it, because I think we recognize, particularly with Sullivan Arena, with the needles in the parks and things like that, and the human excrement and stuff that some of the local individuals are dealing with. How are we setting ourselves up for legal responsibility, and how do we protect ourselves? And more importantly, how do we prevent that? And what are the safeguards do we have to look like so we don't have another future responsibility bill coming down the road? So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. We can get back to you on more of a comprehensive answer at some time in the future.
Great, thanks. All right, let's go ahead and put that slideshow up, please. All right. So I just have a few slides here to get the juices flowing, get people thinking about the 2023-2024 emergency cold weather shelter plan. Next slide, please. So really going to be talking about two things. Going to be talking about different scenarios, which you all have already seen me lay out a couple of scenarios, and then talk about levers. What are the levers that we can pull as policymakers, as the municipality? So let's start with scenarios. So scenario A is what I am calling the everything gets done scenario. So we know that we're talking roughly about 700 total unsheltered individuals currently in our system. This big caveat, right? None of my numbers are going to account for inflow. They do account for planned outflow, but not for unplanned outflow, because a lot of people, not a lot, but some individuals do naturally find their own path out of homelessness, and this doesn't plan for that, but this does plan for what we know is happening. So starting with 700, taking out the 250 for the housing that we know is coming online this summer, and as I've said before, that's going to impact the system in different ways. It might not necessarily be someone going from unsheltered to housing, although for some that might be what happens, but it might just be movement within the system, right? Then taking out another 60 individuals for the allowed camp that the Assembly approved in Midtown, assuming that works for a year-round scenario. And then taking out another 150 for the permanent year-round low barrier shelter. We all are driving towards that goal of getting that shelter up and running by winter. So under scenario A of everything gets done, that sort of is in the works already, that leaves roughly about 240 individuals that are going to need some type of shelter come winter. Scenario B envisions that shelter, as much as we're working towards it, trying to get it done, doesn't happen. And so all the other factors stay the same. That's roughly 390 individuals that are going to need some type of shelter come winter. And then scenario C really goes into nothing gets done, that we are really working towards and driving towards for any number of factors. And so that one just assumes the housing comes online and that's about it. So that's roughly 450 individuals who would need some type of shelter come winter. Now, I haven't refined yet the total, what the real planning number should be, but for the purposes of the rest of this presentation, which there's just a couple slides, that 450 is going to be the number that we're working from. And then at some point, and I don't know if the coalition today is ready to talk about a realistic planning number, but at some point we'd love for the coalition to guide us in terms of what they think is a realistic planning number for emergency cold weather shelter. So then let's talk about levers, right? So those are the three scenarios that we can go off of. From my perspective, we really should be using scenario C for planning purposes for now. So what are the levers? The levers, we don't really have to do too much work in this because the Emergency Cold Weather Shelter Task Force that was stood up by the Assembly last year really did a lot of work of exploring the different levers that can be pulled. And we have, from the 22-23 winter season, some pretty good numbers of what those levers cost. So you can see here there are 4 items that the Emergency Cold Weather Shelter Task Force suggested we look into, with the 5th one being family emergency shelter, but that one's paid through our budget, so we don't have to worry about any additional resources there. So there's, of course, mass shelter, and at 360 individuals, that ran roughly at about $92 per person per day. There's non-congregate shelter, which runs at, it's going to probably change hotel to hotel, but average is probably about $110 per person per day. Semi-congregate shelter, that was a suggestion that the task force came up with, but it was never implemented. In particular, Beans Cafe was the one that had the idea for the semi-congregate shelter. So unknown really what that cost might be. And then there's the expanding existing shelter capacity. And so there's 2 different categories there. There was Covenant House, which did our TAYs, that's transitional age youth. So youth from the age of 18 to 24. So we have shelter for youth 17 and younger, but this age group, 18 to 24, really doesn't fit very well within our existing shelter framework. And so Covenant House developed a specific shelter for those individuals within their footprint. And then we also had an increase of capacity at Covenant House, which is now their new permitted capacity. But you can see the costs there, $88 per person per day for the transitional age youth, and then $106 per person per day for the adults. So what happens when you combine scenario C, which again is from my perspective, what we should be planning for now until we get better numbers, when you combine that and the levers. So this is just looking at October 1 through December 31st, so basically 90 days, and different outputs, right? So if we want to pull one lever, want to pull 2 levers, want to pull a combination of different levers. So if you look at just non-congregate, right? If we were able to just find non-congregate shelter for all the 450, what that would cost, right? Roughly $4.5 million for October through December. If we were to do a mix of non-congregate and expanding existing shelter space, that's both for transitional age youth and for single adults, that's roughly $4.4 million. And then if we were to do some type of shelter, notice I'm not using the word mass shelter because 150 individuals isn't a mass shelter. That's just in municipal code, the maximum a shelter can be within the municipality without getting further approvals from the assembly. So if we were to do a shelter at a certain number, 150 here, do a mix of pull that lever, pull the non-congregate lever, pull the expanding existing shelter lever, that's $4.35 million. So if you can see here pretty plainly that sort of regardless of the levers that you pull, the numbers are pretty similar, right? 4.3 at the low end, 4.45 at the high end. So, and I also just want to, one note, if we go back one slide. So and I forgot to mention this earlier, but the 360 individuals at $92 per person per day, When you increase that number to above 360, then it decreases the total dollar per amount per person per day. When you decrease the number of individuals, then it increases the total dollar amount per person per day. So just for planning purposes and for this exercise, I did increase the total from 92 per person per day, and I increased it up by $15 per person per day for 150 individuals in a shelter. Because that's just naturally what happens. So last slide, just for some key takeaways. So first is that we should try and get the total planning number as small as possible, and also try to get a firm planning number, preferably from the coalition, if they could provide that for us. But as much as possible, we should try to shave that number down by being successful with all of the other efforts that we are already working towards, whether that's the allowed camp in Midtown, the shelter that we are working towards getting stood up by the end of the year, and possibly any other efforts which our foundations and our philanthropy and our for-profit businesses maybe want to help us out, right? So try to shave that number down as small as possible. Second key takeaway for me is that costs really don't change all that much for each of the levers, but what's really critically important is understanding capacity, right? Do we realistically have capacity in our non-congregate space, which is traditionally hotels, for all of the population? That is an unknown, but that leads me to the third key takeaway, which is that planning early, which is what we are hoping to do now. We really didn't start planning for the 22-23 cold weather shelter in earnest until it was August, September, that we really started planning for that. So we're ahead of the ball now. So planning early, I think, is going to give us a better sense of the capacity so that we know what levers we can pull realistically if we're going to have 200 non-congregate hotel rooms available, or 300, or some other number, right? So I think that's pretty much it in terms of just some initial thoughts for us to consider as we plan. And I think, budget numbers are also something that we need to be considering as well. Before I go to members who maybe have questions, I'm just going to turn it to the health department to see if they want to add anything to this.
Through the chair to Mr. Rivera, I think one of the biggest concerns that we have is this $92 a day doesn't account for facility costs. This is just for operations. And so realistically, these numbers are a lot lower than what we're actually going to be looking at going into winter. And as you know, I will continue to be the drumbeat that we have no funding for emergency cold weather shelter this year. $0 have been appropriated or allocated for this use.
Thanks. All right. So yeah, I will invite the administration if they want to further do some truthing on these numbers. I think that would be helpful for us as we continue doing this planning effort so that we can have realistic numbers. Want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Constant. And then I believe I have Mr. Solt in the queue, and then, yeah, okay. Thanks. So I will turn to the coalition, and then I'll provide a little clarity on the food.
Thank you, Jessica Parks with the Anchorage Coalition and Homelessness. We don't typically see a reduction in the need through the winter, but we do see some fluctuations depending on the weather, the snowfall. So you'll see surges and reductions based on that, but overall, we don't typically see a reduction in the need.
Thanks. And then I just want to note for the record that we've been also joined by Ms. Branga. And then on the food, so yes, the Assembly did pass a policy. The policy didn't say that, the municipality needs to be the one that pays for it, but the policy did say that this is the minimum standard that we need for food. So whether that's community, churches, like whoever it is, we at least need to be able to meet that minimum level, that minimum policy standard in our food, which is led by, I think it was like USDA or some sort of federal standard. And frankly, we know 3 meals a day is the standard. In terms of other expenses, I don't know, maybe the administration wants to weigh in on that.
Through the chair, I guess I am confused a little bit because I remember the last resolution that the Assembly had passed stated that the contractor at Sullivan Arena had to provide 3 meals and that they could not be donated. So the comment of the municipality didn't have to require it, I do believe we actually codified that we did have to require it. We can give you guys a breakdown if you'd like. I was not prepared to speak on this today, of what the $100 covers. The 3 meals are included, navigation services, et cetera. So we can give you the full rundown of what that costs. 92 is high when we look at like the Sullivan, but 92 is low when we look at something like the Alex Hotel or the Aviator. And so it's kind of a lever, so to speak. But yes, I will get you that data.
Great, thanks. And yeah, happy to double check my recollection on the resolution. Okay, so then next we have Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, 2 questions. One, and first, thank you for this analysis. I think it's really helpful, and especially the numbers both in terms of people and costs. And I understand that we'll probably need to play with both. Clarifying question, if you can go back a couple slides, the 4 point, that one. So, because it says October 1st through December 31st. So that's 3 months, right? Okay. So then if you divide about 4.5 by 3, then I have my numbers wrong, but it's going to be 1.5 or something like that. Actually, this is 1.5. That was easier than I thought. So just to say that we're looking at something in the range of 1.5 million per month to provide whatever this looks like. I think that's helpful in terms of order of magnitude. And of course, we have to check those costs. So then we're not talking yet about 2024. Is that right? This is just to get through this year.
Yeah, I think the assumption being made is that when we get to the November budget, that is when we are going to allocate funds for hopefully we would allocate or figure out a way to allocate funds both for the remainder of the 23-24 winter and then be conscientious of the 24-25 winter / we could leave that to first quarter budget in April if we wanted to.
Okay. And then my other question, if you can go back a couple slides further, I'm interested in it makes sense to me in one sense that the non-congregate cost per person per day is higher. But I wonder, I guess, because I wasn't involved in the discussion with non-congregate this winter. So my first question is, does that include, is it basically a short-term payment, in which case it includes bed tax? And then my other kind of, I guess, more idea is there a way that we could do a longer term contract, maybe it's 3 months to cut off December 31st and basically negotiate a deal with hotels, because we would be filling, and I know we would need to do that through a procurement process and probably get bids from folks, but just to think, is there any way to get that number down? Because what we would be doing is essentially, giving them more certainty, like filling those rooms for a certain period of time. So I just want to put that on the table as something that, I don't know if it's feasible, but.
Yeah, thanks. So I will ask the health department if they know the question on the bed tax, but I'll opine a little bit on the reducing the cost. I do think there is room to get that cost down, and especially because we're planning early. I think that will allow us to have better negotiations and talk to more hotels. I think last year we were in a situation where it was August, September. We needed to get something stood up, so we went with the ones that we knew, and perhaps that did cause a higher cost, right? So that is something I think that we should look at. And then I'll turn to the health department if you know about the bed tax.
Through the chair to Ms. Brawley, we did negotiate hotel prices with the Alex Hotel going into emergency cold weather shelter. The price that was given to us was all inclusive. I'm not unsure if bed tax was included or not. I would assume that would have covered it, but I will get you some clarifying answers on that as well.
If I can just briefly follow up. So I think on the one hand, I don't want to shortchange the municipality's bed tax, but I wonder if there's some room there and I also know there might be legal issues with doing more than 30 days because that's what triggers it basically being housing, right? But I just wonder if there's some way we could waive our own tax and not double charge ourselves, or if that's what was happening. But I also appreciate that we can't go too low because it's still a business that needs to operate. So.
Thanks. Mr. Cross?
Yeah, I think there's something else you.
Sorry, Mr. Cross and then.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said Mr. Costa. No, I really appreciate what Anna brings up because that was exactly where I was going, is that $92 a day times 360 is just short of $34,000 a day, which puts us at just shy of $1 million a month. And that didn't include the facility costs. So 1.5 is what I think you and I were thinking simultaneously. And I guess it's really, we have this bottleneck here because we don't know what we can afford or what we have budget for. I mean, we just had an audit committee here and we realized we're 3 months behind on where we need to be for reporting. And so it's really hard to plan what we can afford. And we need to be able to make sure that that money is evenly divided over what I assume would be 5 months, assuming that we start at the beginning of October for cold weather shelter and need to go through April, we need to go through March for when those weathers, and we're required to provide that. So then we need to have that total amount divided by 5 months. That's what we have. And then that's how many heads we can help. And I think I kind of see ourselves, for me, the easiest way is to kind of, like they do in accounting, back into it, as the term is, so I can figure out what we have. And then once we figure out what that monthly, then that really helps us identify what our ideal properties will be. Because if we can only afford to help 120, if we take our total amount at assuming your numbers are correct, then that'll help us identify the facility we have, because we can only afford to help for 5 months, 100 to 120 or 150. What does that look like? And then what properties fit that, rather than here's what if that makes sense. To me, it helps to back into it. And I think we're really going to be spinning our wheels till we know where we're at financially and how much money we have to spend and what we can divide over that 5 months. I really feel like we can look at all these different options, but we can't commit to anything. And that's going to be, at that point, we're just stuck in the mud. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. Ms. Brawley's idea actually sparks another idea, and I'm not sure, again, similarly, the issues of legality and other constituencies that might have some issue, but we have a ton of hotels in this town. They make their money from basically May through September. We have a bunch of individuals needing a place to live from basically November through April. We have a bed tax that every one of them pays, notwithstanding what we might charge ourselves. The question being, can we provide an exemption from taxation for regular operating hotels that provide some of these services, maybe kind of those B-grade hotels that aren't quite deteriorated, but are kind of not the newest, best places, so that we provide them a way that they can actually save money on their tax bills on an annualized basis without costing ourselves. It would cost Visit Anchorage, it would cost the operation of the Sullivan Arena and the Denida Center, and some grants probably, but there's a novel idea there of an alternative funding source if such a tax exemption would be allowed under the charter, because it was a voter authorized tax. And so I think that's worth investigating as an alternative funding source and as kind of an incentive to get some more hotels on board to provide some of these non-congregate units.
Thank you. Mr. Solt?
I'm good. I'm not in the queue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Then yeah, for me, I'm in the queue next. Yeah, I've heard several times this week about costs and needing to understand what actually, what's the money in the bank so that we can actually make decisions on all the things we're talking about, whether it's the allowed campsite in Midtown, permanent year-round low barrier shelter, emergency cold weather shelter. All of these things that we're talking about have finite costs, and we need to figure out how much money we have in the bank, which to me, I think that is going to be an exercise unto itself to figure that out, and hopefully working with Desiree and possibly OMB. I guess just part of me saying this is probably just a heads up to the budget and finance co-chairs. Is it co-chairs or is it just chairs? Co-chairs that I may be asking for your assistance with that, because that is I think a big part of this work that we need to figure out. With that, I'll go to you, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, just briefly, Chris, I think that's a great idea. I'm happy to start taking that up at the budget committee in concert with all this other work. And I think that is a key question of what we can legally do. And I guess I'll observe what the bed tax and this is something we should ask Mr. Moore before he disappears, is because I know in general we've had a big increase in our revenue because we've had really good, hotel prices are up. It's a value-based tax. So the higher the price, the more tax money we get. And so I believe we're getting more than the minimum. However, I also know that's plugged other holes in our budget or, deficits, things that we've gotten less of. But I think all of that to say, I think that it may be possible for us to, forego some of that revenue in the sense that, it's like you said, it's the winter. There are still certainly tourists year round or visitors, but not as many. And so maybe there's room there because we're not taking away as much revenue that we depend on. But I think it's a good question. So I think I intend to bring this up next week at our Budget and Finance Committee meeting.
Great. All right. Any other discussion? I am totally fine with us ending early. Any other discussion on the emergency cold weather shelter plan? So I think I'll just opine off the top of my head. So for me, it sounds to me like we need to, and I'm going to write this down so I don't forget. So one, get a planning number from the coalition. And I just want to look to the coalition. Is that something you can provide next month? Wonderful. Okay, so then we'll get a better planning number from the coalition next month. Then we need, I guess, to the health department. Could you do me a favor, and particularly on this slide, could the health department true up these numbers just to make sure that they're holistic and accurate? Yeah.
Sorry, through the chair. Yes, I am nodding yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Then we also need to figure out funding sources, and for that, probably we'll rely on a small group, myself, the co-chairs of the Budget and Finance Committee, Desiree Camacho, and OMB, and maybe there's other stuff we need to pull into that as well, for us to really comb through for funding sources for all of the efforts that we have going on. Does that sound about right to folks? Is there any other considerations that we should be planning for? Yeah.
I have two suggestions. One for the health department. You're totally right about the facility costs, and I wonder if it's possible to do a facility operations only cost per day, and maybe it's not scaled by person, but that would be helpful. And maybe it's both looking at a large. Well, I guess we should just look at a shelter that's at 150. So maybe just asking the ones that operate.
Through the chair to Ms. Brawley, did you have a facility, just a Muni-owned facility in mind? It would be heavily dependent on which facility. I can give you prior costs for Sullivan Arena if that would be helpful to you.
I guess that'd be helpful for scale. Sorry, through the chair. But also it may be worth just reaching out. I know we're a public entity. It would be interesting to know from Catholic Social Services what their facility operating costs are for Clare House, for Brother Francis as it is now, and then for complex care shelter, because those represent 3 different populations that are being served. So knowing the range would be helpful. And also if the facility costs range by population type. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is, sorry, I lost it. I'll come back to it.
Thanks. Any other discussion? Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brown.
So at some point this winter, I ran into a chart that, is how much per client at a hotel per day and how much, where is that chart housed? I was just gonna, does anyone know?
Yeah, thanks. Let me see if I can find that chart on the committee website. Yeah, so it was the Emergency Cold Weather Shelter Task Force that came up with that chart, and in particular the coalition. I'm just going to see if I can find it somewhere.
Thank you. I thought that was a helpful.
Any other discussion while I look up that chart?
Yeah, sorry, I did remember my other thing. It was just about the alcohol tax fund balance. So notwithstanding the fact that as I've said, we don't want to spend all of it on homelessness. My previous understanding or assumption was that we had reallocated all of the fund balance, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily true for 2022, which we didn't know at the time, or rather the Assembly didn't know at the time during the first quarter budget revisions. So it is possible there's some funding there. However, I will caution it will be limited. And it's basically representing things that we identified as budget priorities that did not pan out for one reason or another, or did not get spent. So just to say, this would not be a long-term solution, but it is potentially more than $0. Whereas before I thought there was going to be $0 in that category, but we don't know yet.
So I did find the chart in a presentation, so I'm going to forward it to you, Travis, and it's slide 13 in this presentation that I'm sending to you.
Thank you.
While Travis is pulling that up, any other discussion folks have? I think we have a decent path forward. Of course, fully recognize and fully hear it is going in 1 year and staying in. That funding is a critical component of this.
I do have a question, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've missed a special meeting, and I think this is the regular meeting, and then there's 2 special meetings coming up. What's the work plan?
Yeah, so I'm going to keep the emergency cold weather shelter work in our regular meetings. And then the special meetings next week, we just have 2 more planned for clean slate stuff. So that's criteria. So that is Monday and Wednesday is the criteria work for shelter. And the goal, the end product for Wednesday is to have some type of resolution which can be put on the June 20th agenda for debate on June 11th. That's what I meant, yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, and could we put that in presenter mode? And okay, all right. So that a little bit small for folks, but yeah, that is the work that the emergency cold weather shelter task force did along with the coalition, and it's just a comparison of sort of breaking down costs of shelter and different types of shelter, whether it's a municipally owned facility or a leased facility, and then hotels. In terms of non-congregate, and then housing, and it's super obvious sort of what the most cost-effective solution is here. But of course, as we all know, housing is not something that we can necessarily get stood up by October 1 in massive amounts. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Brunga.
So that's why I was thinking about it, because your chart, the non-congregate, you had 110 per month. And this is like saying, yeah, quite a bit cheaper.
So my numbers were based on reality, right? They were based
and this
on
might not be reality.
Well, this was, I think, projections, right? My numbers were based off what we expended in the 22-23, just based off the documents, right, of what we appropriated. So maybe not exactly what we expended, but what we appropriated, right? And so my hope is that come next month, maybe the numbers will look a little bit more fine-tuned. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Brawley?
One other observation on the data, the reason why it might be showing the total is cheaper is just the number of individuals in it. So if the Sullivan had 400 people or whatever the number was, that's the difference. So we're paying more per person, but overall we paid less because we had fewer people. That would be my guess if those numbers are still roughly accurate.
Mrs. Johnson, can you remind me the Tudor Elmore Nav Center, that building, do you know what its actual capacity was able to service? I know that the assembly reduced it down to 150 with a 200 surge, but do we remember what that was? Whether we use it there or use it somewhere else? I'm just trying to get an idea that building was capable of.
Through the chair, I'm going to answer your question in a kind of roundabout way. Best practice is 50 square feet per person in the shelter site, like in the shelter site as a whole. The original square footage of the navigation center was roughly 59,500 and some odd square feet. That footprint was shrank in half, so it's now 29,600. And so if you do 50 square feet per person minus some of the rooms and offices, we could roughly hold 400-ish, 350, 360. But right now code requires us to be at 150.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
So, yeah, I mean, that number by 50 is closer to 600, but minus spaces that might be otherwise dedicated. I just wanted to point out a little humorous note that, and this is no chastisement to you, Mr. Chair, you said your numbers are based on reality, right? And then it became clear that the reality your numbers were based on was the appropriation. And so what I want folks to hear, if you're ever listening, is that reality in this case is very subjective. And I think you used the term, Mr. Cross, that we have to interrogate it because the reality depends on the question and what we're trying to do. And so just that's a philosophical comment that it's very interesting to think. There are a number of realities at play here that we're trying to work on.
Thanks. Good point. Right. Any other discussion? We good to go? I feel like we have a decent work plan. I guess I'll just turn to the health department. Are there any, so just reiterating, right? We're going to for next month, we're going to get a clear planning number, and that's going to impact everything, right? We're going to get clear fiscal numbers of a sort of cost per person per day as much as possible in that range so that we can compare different levers in a realistic way. And then maybe not finalized, but at least maybe started some sense of funding sources by next month's meeting. So I guess I'll turn to the health department. Does that sound good to you, or are there other things you want us to consider?
Just from my standpoint, I do want to, because we know that limited funding, I mean, we are at zero. We're starting from zero. We have no funding appropriated for this. All the alcohol tax for 2023 has been allocated, and what's left of 2022 is probably within the 100,000s, if I'm being truthful. We really should explore possible warming sites that do not have massive amounts of resources because we cannot afford them unless they are voluntarily given to us. I do want to explore that. It's an unfortunate situation that we're in, but with limited funding, I think keeping people alive is the priority, and housing focused is the goal. So I would just possibly want to explore that option. As far as finances, I would love to have the discussion because everywhere we have looked, there are no finances for this plan. And so I can give you the three opportunity plan, which is, the economy, the premier and first class, and we'll bring it forward and say, this is what we can fund, what we should fund and what we want to fund. So I hope that kind of brings some clarity for next month. And as for next week, I'm out for the next 9 days. And so hopefully no big decisions without me, but thanks so much.
Thanks. And you do bring a good point that, yeah, the levers that we are looking at in terms of the actual things that we could stand up are all based off of the Emergency Cold Weather Shelter Task Force. I don't think that they recommended warming sites, but it is something historically the municipality has done. When the downtown transit center was open, we did use that as a warming site. And so that's something to consider, as well as we didn't really talk here about, are there other levers that aren't on the list that we want to consider? One of the ones that we tend to go to every time we have these discussions is churches. And, can we push on churches to do more in this space. So certainly, I'm open to having that discussion in a more holistic fashion next month to see if there are other possible opportunities. Any other final discussion before I move on to audience participation? All right, not seeing any then. Would any members of the public like to participate? Yeah, coming up. Welcome. You'll have 3 minutes and I'll put the timer on my phone.
Sure, thank you. Roger Branson, mental health advocate. A long time. I want to talk about the positive stuff that I'm seeing done here and how appreciative of it and how it's a culmination of a lot of hard work. I became an advocate back in the mid 80s when I got caught up in the system, and I've been a volunteer advocate since that time. In the early 90s, we formed the Mental Health Trust Authority. And one of the first things they recognized and realized was that we didn't have data. We didn't know who the people were. We didn't know what the needs were. And this community, through the effort of the coalition of different people who care and are really concerned for these people, have done a lot of work, have brought us a long ways to where we know the numbers. We know who the people are. We know their needs. We know their disabilities. And we started to put a face to them to rehumanize who these folks are. I was really troubled earlier this meeting about some comments that were made about the Cuddy Park abatement and the people that got abated from there that weren't mentioned. The health department expressed sincere regret over not notifying or not the contractor that is pulling there, and what a problem it was for them, what a challenge it was for the promoter what a problem that is for the promoter, and totally left off the 100 individuals who had moved there, not knowing what their future was, and that they had no heads up, no warning, no idea that they were going to get abated. I find this attitude, a continuing attitude of dehumanizing who these people are, and more than just dehumanizing them, disenfranchising them, not recognizing them as residents, as citizens of our community. And it just tears my heart open. These people deserve to be recognized. They deserve to be treated like human beings. And I was very troubled by that because, there were 100 or so folks that did get displaced with very little notice, other than the condemnation that happens in the community that serves to disenfranchise them. That's how they got notified. So we've come a long ways. We're close to really doing something substantial, and let's continue the good work. Let's acknowledge who these folks are and give them a hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any other member of the public like to participate? Welcome.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Just the talk about the numbers and the assumptions. I was a member of the Emergency Shelter Task Force and specifically on the subcommittee that looked at all of this. And so I can share with the group that on the ACH website, we preserved all of the task force work. So there's a sub-page with all of that information, including the report, which has those charts that were part of that. But I can tell you very quickly that the least non-congregate shelter assumptions were a $60 per night room rate, which, as Assemblymember Vera pointed out, turned out to be a somewhat unrealistic number to negotiate, at least last year. But I share the hopes of everyone that if that is an option we move forward, that we can be having these discussions early enough to be able to bring some of those costs down as much as possible. But if anyone is interested in a direct link, let me know. But all of that information, including the assumptions for each one of those categories, is out on that website.
I think it's relating to the direction of the microphone. And so if the microphone were rotated 90 degrees, it probably will stop the feedback loop. It's a direction. It's not you, but I just think practically speaking, it's the receiver. So, but just a thought. Internal.
Thanks. All right. Any other member of the public? I don't know if we have anyone on the phone, Travis. Okay. So if any members of the public on the phone would like to participate, it's *6 to unmute yourself. All right. Not hearing anyone. Let me just look at the agenda really quick. Is there any other committee discussion? Not hearing any, then I'll go ahead and adjourn us 10 minutes early. Thanks, everyone.